Let's take a look at chapter 1 with an introduction to logistics and supply chain management. So, what is logistics management? Well, it's part of supply chain management that plans, implements, and controls the efficient and effective forward or reverse flow and storage of goods, services, and related information between the point of origin and point of consumption in order to meet customers' requirements. So, but what about supply chain management? Well, supply chain management is the planning and management of all activities involved in sourcing, procurement, conversion, and all logistics management activities. So it integrates supply and demand management across companies, and it also includes coordination and collaboration with channel partners, so suppliers, third party service providers, customers. So you just need to know that if you see efficient and effective flow and storage of goods and services, point of origin and point of consumption for customers' requirements, you know that's logistics management. And when you see planning and management of all activities in sourcing, procurement, conversion, you know that's supply chain management. So some mega trends that we're seeing right now is globalization, the pandemic, demographic shifts, empowered consumer, technological revolution, and climate change. But now let's take a look at third-party logistics, so contract or outsourcing logistics. So this is a management structure where a third party fulfills certain roles and responsibilities regarding the provision of logistics services between the supplier, the first party, and the clients or customers, second party. For example, a 3PL warehouse receives inventory and logs it into stock, 3PL being third party logistics provider. And then with fourth party logistics, outsourcing, this is outsourcing the entire supply chain or logistics management. So 3PL, warehouse, transportation, packaging, everything. So you're outsourcing the entire supply chain or logistics management. So in Porter's value chain and competitive advantage, you'll actually see that support activities include firm infrastructure, human resource management, technological development, and procurement. This is the margin, right? And then primary activities include inbound logistics, operations, outbound logistics, marketing and sales, and then service. But now let's take a closer look at the elements in Porter's value chain and competitive advantage. So in terms of primary activities, we've got inbound logistics. And this includes activities such as receiving, storing, listing, and grouping inputs to the product. For example, materials handling, warehousing, inventory management, transportation scheduling, and managing suppliers. So this is receiving, storing, listing, and grouping inputs to the product. Then we take a look at operations. This includes machining, packaging, assembly, maintenance of equipment, testing, operational management, etc. Then we have outbound logistics, which is also part of the primary activities. And these are activities such as order processing, warehousing, transportation scheduling, and distribution management. Then we have marketing and sales. These are activities that make or convince buyers to purchase the company's products, including advertising, promos, selling, pricing, channel selection, retail management, etc. And then lastly, we have service. This is maintaining the product of the sale, thus guaranteeing quality and or adding value in other ways such as through installation, training, servicing, spare parts or provision, and upgrading. Now let's take a look at the support activities or secondary activities. So first of all, we have procurement. This includes purchasing raw materials, servicing, supplies, negotiating contracts with suppliers, securing building leases, etc. So this is procurement. Then we have technology development. This includes research and development (R&D), product or process improvements, redesign, developing new services, etc. Then we have HR management, human resource management. This includes recruitment and education, compensation, employee retention, etc. Then we have infrastructure. This includes general management, planning procedures, finance, accounting, public affairs, and quality management. So those are all the secondary or support activities, and there are 4 of them. And in terms of the primary activities, there are 5 of them. Now we move on to customer service, chapter 2. So customer service has the potential to provide the distinctive difference between competing firms' offerings, and satisfactory customer service is a direct output of the logistics function by ensuring the availability of the market offering to the customer in the right place and time. So who is or what is a customer? Well, this is the party that patronage, an organization by purchasing its products or services. And then the logistics perspective is basically any person at the receiving end of a delivery that can exist internally or externally to the organization. So that's the logistics perspective. Both internal and external customers are to be provided with replicated, timely, and accurate delivery. So when we look at customer service, there are three elements that we look at: pre-transaction elements, transaction elements, and then post-transaction elements. So you need to know that pre-transaction elements are policies to create a climate for satisfactory customer service, and this happens before a purchase. And then transaction elements are the physical distribution of the product and exceeding customer expectations. And this happens during the purchase. And then we have post-transaction elements. And this occurs after transactions, resulting in the change of ownership being concluded. And this happens after the purchase. So first of all, let's take a look at the pre-transaction elements. There are 5 of them. The first one is the statement of policy. So this is a document that guides the way employees and organizations approach customer service. So it's a customer service policy. Then we have customer acknowledgement. So this is an acknowledgement that lets a customer know that a company heard them and what they said is important. Then we have organizational structure. This includes creating and enabling organizational structure by formalizing the reporting structure, delegating authority, and allocating responsibility. Then we have capacity flexibility. So this is being able to adapt to meet customer needs. And also the system that the organization uses should have flexibility and contingency plans built into it. Then we have technical services, and this refers to the support and assistance provided by a company or service provider to the customers before a sale or transaction takes place. So this type of service is focused on helping customers understand the technical aspects of a product or service, answering questions about features, specifications, installation, and other technical details. Now let's take a look at the transaction elements. So first of all, we have the stock out level. And this is when customer goodwill is maintained by offering a suitable substitute, shipping from another location, or expediting the shipment once the out of stock item arrives. Then we move on to back order ability. So back order means that a product is unavailable for immediate purchase, but there's an upcoming restock date for making it available in the future. This way, a buyer pays in advance for the item and waits for the product's restocking or delivery. Then we move on to the order cycle time. This is the elapsed time between when a customer order, purchase order, or service request is placed and when the product or service is received by the customer. Then we move on to transshipment. This is shipping products between various distribution locations so as to avoid stockouts and possible obsolescence. Then we move on to the other element, system accuracy. Customers expect that the information they receive about order status and stock levels will be accurate. Then we move on to order convenience. So this refers to how easy it is for a customer to place an order. So those were all the transaction elements. Now we move on to the post-transaction elements. First of all, we have installation, warranties and repairs. Then we move on to product tracking, then customer follow-ups, then product packaging. So this protects your products and enhances product perception. Then we have product returns. So those are all post-transaction elements. So now we move on to the more broader elements of customer service. So the first element we look at is time, the length of time it takes to fulfill an order from the moment it's placed. Then we go on to dependability, the extent to which a seller or supplier's deliveries are consistent with the customer's expectations. Then we move on to convenience. This recognizes differences in customers. Their logistics requirements tend to differ. Then we move on to communication. This relates to the handling of order-related information. So the broader elements of customer service are time, dependability, convenience, and communication. Now let's take a look at basic customer service dimensions. So the first one is inventory availability. So the product or service should be available. And then the second dimension we look at is operational performance. So this is the manner in which activities along the supply chain are undertaken. So the primary considerations here are speed, consistency, and flexibility, and recovery. So the first one is speed. So this is order cycle time. And then consistency, ability to render a certain level of service. Then we have flexibility. Organization is adaptive to customers' specific requirements. Then we have recovery, anticipating some malfunctions and preparing contingency plans to address them. And then the last customer service dimension we're going to look at is service reliability. So organizations' ability and willingness to provide assurance that customers' expectations will be met. Now let's take a look at customer service strategy. So there are 4 methods. So the first one is customer strategy based upon customers' reaction to stockouts. And the second one being customer/revenue trade-offs. Then we have customer product contribution. Then the fourth method is customer service audit. So we're going to be taking a look at customer strategy based upon customers' reaction to stockouts, as well as customer service audit. So customer strategy based on customers' reaction to stockouts. So this is where the customer settles for a substitute. So the manufacturer is affected in this case. And then if the customer is insistent on a particular product or brand, the retailer is affected in this situation. Now let's talk about the customer service audit strategy. So there are 4 stages. The first one is external customer service audit. Second stage is internal customer service audit. Third stage is development of potential solution. And the fourth stage is establishment of customer service levels. Let's talk about the first stage, the external customer service audit. So this is where you must determine the expectations of the customer, determine components that customers consider to be the key determinants of their decision to make a purchase. This provides useful info relating to value hierarchy of key elements of customer service, performance rating of the organization relative to competitors on the basis of each critical customer service element. And then let's take a look at the second stage, internal customer service audit, right? We just finished the external one. This is where you must determine what the organization is doing in terms of customer service offerings, determine manner in which customer services are measured, standards of performance, and extent to which these standards are being met by the organization. And then we move on to the third stage, development of potential solutions. So this is where you do a comparative analysis of the results of both audits, would reveal areas where shortcomings exist or where organizations' offerings are equal to or exceed customer expectations. Then development of solutions that aim to overcome customer service shortcomings or improve on current performance levels. Then the fourth stage, establishment of customer service levels. So development of a system for measuring and monitoring performances. Finally, let's take a look at the measures of customer service performance. So the first measure of customer service performance is turnaround times. So turnaround times are the amount of time it takes to respond to a customer's inquiry or request. Then another measure is the number of customer complaints. Another measure is queuing time. Then another measure is ratio of timely shipment of orders. And then another measure is the number of items on back orders. So back order is when a product is unavailable for immediate purchase, but there's an upcoming restock date for it to be available in the future. So then a buyer pays in advance for the item and waits for the product's restocking or delivery, right? And remember, that was a transaction element. Another measure of customer service performance is percentage product availability. And then the last one we're going to look at is order cycle time. And this is the time elapsed between customer order, purchase order, service request, and when the product or service is received by the customer. And remember, this is also a transaction element. Now we move on to supply management with chapter 4. So now let's take a look at purchasing. What is purchasing? Well, it entails buying products or services from other firms in a legal and ethical manner. It involves supplier identification and selection, buying, negotiation and contracting, supply market research, supplier measurement and improvement, and purchasing systems development. And now let's take a look at sourcing. So we just looked at purchasing. Now we're looking at sourcing. Well, sourcing is the process of identifying, evaluating, selecting, and managing suppliers, including purchasing, but wider concept. Now let's take a look at supply management. Well, supply management is the identification, acquisition, positioning, and management of resources and capabilities that a firm needs to meet its strategic objectives. So on a diagram, you'll see there's an upstream, which is like going down to the left, and then a downstream going to the right. And downstream, you'll have a first tier customer and a second tier customer, and that involves outbound logistics. The focal firm is involved with internal logistics. And then on the upstream to the left, you have the second tier and the first tier supplier, and their inbound logistics takes place, and the whole thing is supply chain management. So now let's take a look at supply management's impact on a firm's bottom line. So let's take a look at its role in increasing sales. Well, it's getting a firm's products faster to its markets by improving quality, by providing pricing flexibility, by being innovative, and by enhancing customer satisfaction. So this is its role in increasing sales, right? Getting firms' products faster to markets, improving quality, pricing flexibility, innovative, customer satisfaction. Now let's take a look at its role in reducing total costs. Well, it reduces acquisition costs, improving product design, reducing the cost of quality and downtime, risk costs, shorter cycle times, overall supply chain costs, and part ownership costs. So that was supply management's impact on a firm's bottom line. So its role in increasing sales and its role in reducing total costs. So let's take a look at supply management's links with other departments in the firm. Well, it has links to the logistics and supply department, manufacturing and operations department, engineering department, quality department, IT, legal, finance, and marketing department. So now we move on to the strategic sourcing process, okay? So the first step is conducting a spend analysis. So here you need to determine what's being bought and what money is spent on, right? And then identify the suppliers from whom they are buying products and services from, and understand internal department spending. So this is conducting a spend analysis, right? Now we move on to the second stage or step of the strategic sourcing process, analyzing the supply market. So determine the number of possible suppliers who can provide the product or service, determine the number of buyers who will potentially buy the product or service, and then determine the nature of competition within these markets. So in terms of determining the number of possible suppliers who can provide the product or service, you need to look at the sources like trade journals and directories, suppliers' websites and annual reports, suppliers' sales staffs, internet and social media, supplier catalogs, trade shows and conferences. This is to determine the number of possible suppliers who can provide that product or service. The third step in the strategic sourcing process is developing a sourcing strategy. So the first thing you need to do is categorize suppliers according to spend and supply risk, the portfolio analysis or Kraljic graph or whatever. The make or buy decision, assessing location of suppliers, determining optimal number of suppliers to use, so supply-based optimization, deciding to use a manufacturer or a distributor, and then we have green sourcing considerations. So in terms of the categorization of suppliers according to spend and supply risk, you're going to have a graph, and on the y-axis is going to be the supply risk going up, right? And then on the x-axis, you're going to have the value spend, okay? Usually, you're going to have to calculate how much the business owner spends on each ingredient or product or service, right? You calculate the percentage of the total cost each ingredient takes to determine whether it's a high or low value spend or the profit impact. And then you're going to be given a scenario, and then you're going to have to analyze whether suppliers are high or low supply risk by assessing whether there's few or many suppliers providing that specific product or service. And then you lastly need to classify each product using the Kraljic matrix and provide a reason. So if a supplier has a high supply risk but a low value spend or low profit impact, then it's a bottleneck product, right? You're going to find this on the top left corner of the Kraljic matrix. Bottleneck product means high supply risk, low value spend, right? If a product has a low supply risk and a low value spend or profit impact, then it's a routine or non-critical product. And you'll find this on the bottom left corner of the Kraljic matrix, right? And then if a product has a high supply risk, meaning that there's few suppliers who supply this product or service, and a high value spend or profit impact, so it takes up a large percentage of the total cost, then this is a strategic or critical product, right? And you'll find this on the top right corner of the Kraljic matrix. So that's when it has a high supply risk and a high value spend. Then if you have a product that has a low supply risk, meaning that there's many suppliers who provide this product or service, and it has a high value spend, then this is a leveraged product, right? It has a high profit impact or value spend, but a low supply risk, right? This is a leveraged product, and you'll find this at the bottom right corner of the Kraljic matrix. Let's talk a bit about the make or buy decision. So basically, when you're making it, it means it's insourcing. So you're making the product in-house in your own company. But in management, you should only do this if it's your core competency. So if it's your like competitive edge. So you should only in-source or make the product in-house, make it if it's your core competency. If it's not your core competency, then you can buy it, right? You can outsource this product. Now we move on to the fourth step in the strategic sourcing process, right? Evaluating potential suppliers. Here you will evaluate supplier performance, supplier surveys, financial condition analysis, third-party evaluators, evaluation conference, supplier facility visits, and analysis of capability. Now we move on to the fifth step, which is supplier selection. Here we're going to give you, let's say, supplier A, B, and C, and then we're going to compare or rank these suppliers according to, let's say, 3 categories: quality, delivery time, and price. And each of these categories or attributes are going to be given weights. And then for each supplier, there'll be a rating. And what you need to do is you need to basically multiply their rating with the weighting and then get their score, add up their score, and then whoever has the highest score will get chosen as a supplier. So the most suitable supplier will be the one with the highest score, and they have the highest score based on quality, delivery time, and price, right? In some questions, they'll say, who's the best in terms of delivery time? And let's say a company values delivery time over the other categories. Then you'll select the supplier based on just that metric, delivery time. And also, if a supplier has a high rating for price, it doesn't mean their price is high. It actually means that their price is quite affordable. So they get a higher ranking, a higher score in terms of price. And if they don't give you a rating, they'll give you a percentage, and you'll have to find the rating from the rating scale that they give you, like a table that they give you. Now we move on to the sixth step of the strategic sourcing process: reaching agreement with suppliers. So here you're going to have competitive bidding, and there's going to be an RFQ involved, so a request for quote for pricing. Then there's also going to be an RFP, so a request for proposal. So this is when you want more complex information, more detail. Then you have negotiations, and this is done by the procurement professionals, right? Then you have adversarial negotiations. These are win-lose negotiations. Then you have collaborative negotiations, so win-win negotiations. Then we move on to contracts, right? And the typical contract content is deliverables, terms of the contract, contract pricing arrangements, for example, fixed cost contract, etc. Then you have penalty clauses and dispute prevention, so mediation, arbitration, etc. And then now we move on to the seventh and last step of the strategic sourcing process. And this is supplier management and supplier development, right? So supplier relationships, these are characteristics of transactional versus collaborative relationships. So transactional relationships are short, there's no critical items, switching cost is low, information sharing, there's no information sharing, the importance of technology is low, supply risk is low, focus is on price, and the connectedness is, there's no connectedness, it's very independent. The level of trust is also low. Whereas collaborative relationships are long, there's critical items there, switching cost is pretty high because you don't want to move away from someone you've already built rapport with. And then information sharing, there's a lot of that happening. Importance of technology is high, supply risk is high. The focus is on the total cost, not just the price. And then it's interdependent, so there is connectedness, and the level of trust is high. Then we talk a bit about supplier performance monitoring and improvement. So performance measurement categories are price and cost, quality, timeliness and responsiveness, order completeness and correctness, social responsibility, regulatory compliance. And then what is supplier development? Well, supplier development is working collaboratively with critical, strategic, and high potential suppliers to improve their capabilities and competitiveness for the mutual benefit of customers and the suppliers themselves. And now we take a look at the purchasing cycle. So there are three types of purchasing situations. So the first type is a new buy. So this is a new buy from a new supplier. Then we have a modified buy. So this is reordering a product from the same supplier with slight alterations. Then we have a straight rebuy. So this is when you're buying from known suppliers, the contract is already in place and everything, and you're buying the exact same thing. Now let's take a look at the steps of the purchasing cycle. Well, first there's the recognition and description of a need, and then there's the ordering, then follow up and expediting, so soon to be due or overdue products, then invoice clearing and payment, and then maintenance of records. Then we move on to integrity and ethics in supply management. So some examples of unethical behavior is reciprocity, saying that no, I'll give you this deal if you do this for me. Personal buying, accepting supplier favors, sharp practices, financial conflicts of interest. And in terms of sharp practices, it's basically dropping the price of products with some underhanded methods, like saying you'll buy in bulk, then you only buy 2 or 3, but now it's at a lower price. Now we move on to inventory management with chapter 5. So what is inventory? Well, inventory includes raw materials. These are stored while awaiting utilization or consumption in the process of making a finished product. Then we have work in progress items. So these are stored while waiting to be worked on during the next sequential task in the manufacturing process. Then we have parts or equipment. These are stored in readiness for utilization in maintenance, repair, or operations tasks. Then we have finished items. These are kept in stock in order to be able to satisfy customers' demand when they arise. So inventory includes raw materials, work in progress items, parts or equipment, and finished items. So what are the common types of inventory? Well, the first type we have is cycle stock. So portion of inventory that's carried specifically for the purposes of satisfying regular orders. So for manufacturing, production items, and for sales, items to satisfy sales orders, right? And then the second type of common inventory is safety stock. So safety stock is a portion of inventory items held as a buffer to enable the organization to cushion the effects of uncertainties in demand and or supply. So this is them keeping stock just in case. And then the third type we have is anticipation stock, right? Anticipation stock is companies carry this because of the high likelihood of occurrence of a future event which justifies stocking quantities of the item above regular cycle quantities. For example, price increases, strikes, upcoming maintenance, etc. So they carry this because of a high likelihood of a future event. And then we have seasonal stock. These are items carried in store simply because of the levels of demand characteristic to particular periods of the year can be categorized as seasonal stock. So essentially, these items are carried in store simply because of the levels of demand that are associated to particular periods of the year. And then the fifth common type of inventory is promotional stock. So promotional stock is carried so that high levels of demand due to a promotion campaign can be satisfied, right? Whenever they have a discount on something, they make sure that they carry a lot of that thing, right? Then the sixth type is dead stock. This is stock that an organization may have but can't utilize as was intended. So maybe it's kept too long in storage, expired, outdated, or it's been recalled because of listeriosis or malfunctions. And then the seventh and last type of common inventory is non-conformant stock. So non-conformant stock is similar to dead stock. The difference is that they can still be utilized by other parties, right? It could still be used by other parties or companies for something. For example, printer ink cartridges. So the 7 common types of inventory is cycle stock, safety stock, anticipation stock, seasonal stock, promotional stock, dead stock, and non-conformant stock. So now that we've learned about the common types of inventory, what is the purpose of holding inventory? Well, it's for creating a cushion for uncertainties, holding batch stock, providing for seasonal stock or anticipation stock, providing for strategic stock, enabling smooth production processes, compliance with legal or contract requirements, so guaranteeing stock, overcoming supply disappointments, and compensating for a shutdown in production. So when we talk about creating a cushion for uncertainties, there's three major kinds. So there's uncertainty in demand, there's uncertainty in supply, and uncertainty in yield. So in terms of uncertainty in demand, it implies that information related to when, how, or if a customer will order is unknown. And then uncertainty in supply refers to when information related to when, how, or if a supplier will deliver the quantity demanded is unknown. And then uncertainty in yield is exactly how much needs to be produced for a finite stock of materials is unknown. But now let's take a look at the inventory holding costs. So there's three inventory holding costs: the capital cost, the cost of obsolescence, and the handling and storage costs. So what is the capital cost? Well, this includes the funds spent to purchase the inventory, as these funds could have been invested in something else. So the rate of return that could have been earned by putting the same money into a different investment with equal risk. So it's the funds spent to purchase the inventory, as these funds could have been invested in something else. So it's the opportunity cost, essentially. Then we have the cost of obsolescence. This is incurred when an item in inventory becomes obsolete before it's used or sold. Then we have the handling and storage costs. This includes mortgage on or rent of a warehouse, salaries for warehouse employees, equipment for handling inventory, etc. Now let's talk a bit about demand and inventory. So we have independent demand and dependent demand. So in terms of independent demand, it's usually finished goods whose demand levels are directly related to existing customer requirements, right? It's independent of any other product. Then we have dependent demand. This is when the demand for the product or item is dependent on the level of demand for another item. So this other item is usually the independent demand item. So when you're looking at a graph of an independent demand stock level, it's going to have zigzags, and basically there's always going to be safety stock, and there's always going to be stock on hand, right? And basically the read order level is equal to the safety stock plus the demand during lead time. So that's the reorder level, the safety stock plus demand during lead time. And for independent demand stock levels, I mean, it'll never drop below the safety stock level. There's always going to be stock on hand. It zigzags, right? They're always trying to keep it on a certain level of 60, let's say. Then for dependent demand stock levels, they don't have any stock on hand. So it can drop below zero. It can only end at zero. It can be zero. And they will only order stock for a particular product or item when a need arises of it. So if they receive an order from someone for that stock, right? So it'll be zero for a time, and then whenever they receive an order, then all of a sudden it will spike up. So it looks blocky. Now let's talk a bit about forecasting. So in terms of forecasting, we have qualitative forecasting for inventory demand and quantitative forecasting. So in terms of qualitative forecasting, we've got the panel consensus method, right? This is a 5-phase process. And then we have the Delphi method, right? It's interactive forecasting process involving a panel of experts. So it's a consensus process, employs the use of a single panel of experts, and it's a number of sequential rounds can take place. And then in terms of the quantitative forecasting, we've got the simple average method of forecasting, the year-to-date method of forecasting, the moving average method of forecasting, and the weighted average method of forecasting. And we're going to take a deeper look at these soon. So in terms of the simple average method of quantitative forecasting, you're basically getting the sum of the forecast and actual demand figures from the previous month and determination of the mean. So essentially, the forecasted figure, or FT plus 1, is equal to AT, which is the actual demand figure from the previous month, plus FT, which is the forecasted demand figure for that month, divided by 2. Then we move on to the year-to-date average method of quantitative forecasting. So the sum of the actual demand figures from previous months and determination of the mean is done here. So FT plus 1 is equal to literally the actual sales figures for all the months or periods. So AT plus A January, February sales figures, March figures, add them all up, divided by the total number of months or periods. And that's the year-to-date average method. Now we move on to the moving average method. So here we get the sum of the actual demand figures from only a predetermined number of previous months in the year and the determination of their mean. So FT plus 1, or the forecasted figure using the moving average method, is a specific number of months or periods, for example 3 months. So you'll get the actual figure for January, actual demand figure for February and March, divided by just the 3 months. You know, it's very specific, the moving average. Then we move on to the weighted average method. So here we have applications of weights to the forecasted and actual demand figures of the previous month only. So essentially the forecasted figure, FT plus 1, is equal to W1, which is the first weight assigned to the actual demand figure, multiplied by the actual demand figure for that particular month, plus W2, which is the second weight assigned to the forecasted demand figure. So W2 is the second weight assigned to the forecasted demand figure times the forecasted demand figure for that particular month. And they'll give you the weight of the forecasted and the actual demand figure. Now we move on to calculating the value of inventory items using the 80-20 rule, Pareto's law. So basically this law states that 80% of something only actually comes from 20% of something else, basically. So in terms of the value of inventory items, usually 20% of your inventory actually makes up 80% of the value of your inventory. So the first step is determining the quantities of inventory items utilized in a period, usually annually. So you determine the quantities. Then the second step is to calculate the expenditure on each item by multiplying the quantity usage by the item's unit cost. So annual expenditure or item value, right? So it's quantity times unit cost. Then step 3 is to rearrange the inventory items in descending order, so high to low. And then the fourth step is to categorize the items accordingly as category A, B, or C. So basically, you need to remember that category A inventory items are 0 to 75% of the item value percentage. Category B items is 0 to 20% of item value percentage. And then category C items are 0 to 5% of the item value percentage. And the category A items are 0 to 75% of the item value or value of inventory, right? But it only makes up 5% of stock. And then category B items make up 0 to 20% of the value of inventory, but they only make up 20% of stock. And then category C items make up 0 to 5% of the value of inventory, but they make up 75% of the stock. So they'll give you a table with a bunch of different items. It'll give you the annual consumption, which is the quantity, and then the unit cost in rands. You times them together, then you get the annual expenditure or item value, and then you're going to rank them of which one takes up the most expenditure or item value in the year, right? Then you're going to rank them from descending order, highest to lowest, and then essentially anything that's 0 to 75% is category A. Then anything that's 0 to 20% is category B. But the way you calculate it is by saying 75% plus 20%. So basically you're evaluating items that have a cumulative percentage of 75% to 95%, right? Then for category C, they make up 0 to 5%, right, of the item value percentage, right? But you're going to evaluate them from 95% to 100%. Now let's take a look at economic order quantity, or EOQ. So the aim of economic order quantity method is to keep inventory costs to a minimum. And the two major cost components to be considered is ordering costs, OC, and holding costs, HC. Ordering costs are all the expenses incurred in the process of placing an order for the items, right? So ordering cost, OC, is equal to the cost of placing an order. Then we have the holding costs, or HC. These are the costs incurred in keeping the inventory item. So holding cost HC is equal to the value of items to be held V times the holding percentage H, right? And then the economic order quantity formula EOQ is equal to the square root of 2 times the annual demand times the ordering cost OC divided by the holding cost. So it's equal to the square root of 2 times annual demand times OC ordering rate or cost divided by HC holding cost. So we're going to start off with warehouse management on chapter 8. So what is the role of warehousing? Well, first of all, warehousing is either performed by network depots or large distribution centers, and it performs an essential role in the supply chain, from inbound raw materials warehousing to outbound finished goods warehousing to outbound finished goods warehousing post-production. So, but what is warehousing? Well, warehousing is any system of storing products at any point in the logistics system from point of origin of goods, so raw materials warehouse, through production, so work in progress or production warehouse, to the point of consumption, so finished goods warehouse or distribution center. So that is warehousing. But you need to know that warehouses are the same as distribution centers, so they are one and the same. Although a distribution center holds inventory at the downstream end of the supply chain. So warehouses are the same as distribution centers, but a distribution center holds inventory at the downstream end of the supply chain. So, but what are warehouses? Well, warehouses are places where raw materials, work in progress goods, and finished goods are stored. And now let's take a look at the different types of warehouses. So the first type we get are inbound warehouses. So inbound warehouses are where goods coming from suppliers are stored before manufacturing. So we have suppliers, and then vehicles get loaded and they're taken to the warehouse. And then from the warehouse, there's volume shipment, and then it's taken to a plant. And then we get an outbound warehouse. And this is where goods coming from a manufacturing plant are en route to customers. So in outbound warehousing, we have a plant first, and then we have volume shipment to the warehouse, then from the warehouse to the customer or market. Then the last type of warehouse we get is a distribution center. This is where goods coming from various manufacturers are sorted and routed to retailers. So here we have plants for various products. Then they go to a warehouse or distribution center. Then from there it goes to various customers. And this involves last mile logistics. So distribution centers where goods coming from various manufacturers are sorted and routed to retailers. So why do firms use warehouses and distribution centers? Well, the first reason is to achieve economies of scale. So it's to achieve production economies and to take advantage of quantity purchasing discounts and forward buys. Then another reason why firms use warehouses and DCs is to maintain a source of supply, to support firms' customer service offerings, and to meet changing market conditions. Another reason is to help overcome the time and space or distance gap that exists between the producer and the end consumer. So to accomplish least total cost logistics and to service the needs of a firm more effectively. And then another reason why firms use warehouses and distribution centers is to support the just-in-time programs of suppliers. So to keep a steady flow of supply of the product and to enable efficient last-mile logistics. Then another reason is to help provide a level of customer satisfaction and service. And then is to serve as a link between the supplier and the producer. So why do firms use warehouses and distribution centers? Well, it's to achieve economies of scale, to maintain a source of supply, to help overcome the time and space distance gap that exists between producers and the end consumer, to support the just-in-time programs of suppliers, to help provide a level of customer satisfaction and service, and to serve as a link between the supplier and the producer. And now we move on to the purpose of warehousing. Well, there's three main purposes: movement, storage, and information transfer. So in terms of movement, it's receiving activity, transfer, order selection, shipping. And in terms of storage, we have temporary basis, semi-permanent basis. Then in terms of information transfer, we have inventory levels, throughput levels, stock keeping locations, and customer data. Now let's talk about product groupings within the warehouse. So goods can be grouped according to the following three methods: compatibility, so in terms of similarity, complementary, how often products are ordered together, popularity, dependent on turnover rates or demand rates. So in terms of product groupings within the warehouse, we have compatibility. So this is grouping items because of their similarity. So Nike shoes or men, women, and kids. So categories like that. Then we have complementary. So how often products are ordered together. So golf clubs will go with golf shoes, which will go with golf bags, etc. Then we have popularity, and this is dependent on turnover rates and demand rates. So Samsung S10, they'll put it with the iPhone 11s and all the other new tech, etc. So we just spoke about the product groupings, but now let's talk about categorization of inventory within warehouse. So things can be categorized according to the following methods. So it's according to demand frequency. So customers, both internal and external, want items from the warehouse at different times of the year. So you can categorize it according to demand frequency. Then you can categorize them according to pick destination. So goods can be stored and categorized based on going to the same destination. And then we have according to special storage requirements. So maybe hazardous goods, so radioactive materials, poisonous materials, etc. will go together. Then we have perishables, so dairy, meat, flours, etc. So now let's talk a bit about cross-docking. So in terms of cross-docking, we'll have inbound trucks, right? And then they start unloading. And then we have cross-docking, goes on to cross-docking. Then this goes to outbound trucks. So cross-docking maximizes the use of transport opportunities and reduces storage space needs. So basically, they don't store the stuff anyway. Essentially, it just goes from one truck that unloads stuff to another truck, which unloads stuff to another outbound truck. So an inbound truck and then an outbound truck. Now let's take a look at the typical activities performed in a warehouse. Well, the major functions are movement, storage, and information transfer. And this gives rise to the following activities. So the receiving process, placing, storage, replenishment, order picking, checking, packing and marking, staging and consolidation, loading and shipping, clerical and administration function, housekeeping, maintenance, inventory management, value-added services, assembly functions, and create or break bulk. Let's talk a bit more about creating and breaking bulk. So in terms of creating bulk, you have trucks with goods, right? And they just all come to the warehouse. Then from the warehouse, they move on to another truck. So creating bulk is basically packing products together and creating one big pallet, right? And then let's talk about breaking bulk. Well, here you got a truck with goods that goes to the warehouse, and then from the warehouse, all those goods get separated. So we have trucks with goods. They just get separated into these different trucks. So breaking bulk is basically separating and distributing the goods in the big pallet. So what are the most common warehousing problems? Well, it's storage space utilization, product handling problems, labor intensity associated with warehousing, information gaps between warehousing and manufacturing or retailing, costing and budgeting is often difficult too. But now let's move on to warehouse performance management. So there are 10 key metrics for measuring warehouse performance. So we've got warehouse space utilization, productivity of warehouse staff, stock turnover ratio, receiving efficiency of inbound stock, order picking accuracy, rate of returns, back order rate, order cycle time, warehouse carry cost of inventory, warehouse yard turnaround of inbound or outbound docked vehicles, and measuring warehouse staff performance. So that is warehouse performance management and the key metrics for measuring it. So what are some of the current and future trends in warehousing? Well, we have faster order entry and faster order fulfillment, faster processing of order returns, improved warehouse management system user interfaces, the rise of automation and autonomous guided vehicles, increased use of wearable technologies, millennial mindset management, faster big data analysis and AI, increased digitization of the full supply chain and warehousing process, increased use of blockchain within the supply chain and warehousing, track and trace systems, and increased information of things, connection of everything. Now we move on to transport management with chapter 7. So let's take a look at some of the functions of transport. So first off, we have inbound transport. So this is the transport of raw materials or components from suppliers to the plants. Then we have on-site transport. So this is when transfer vehicles or mobile robots take pallets or break bulk units from the raw material store or warehouse to the production line, then take the finished goods from the final production line to the finished goods store, right? Then we move on to outbound transport, and this refers to finished goods on pallets in containers or taut liner trucks to distribution centers or direct store deliveries in the case of full truck or container loads. Now let's take a look at the demand for transport. So we've got land use, development or economic activity, and then you've got derived demand and then induced demand. So derived demand corresponds to passenger transport services, and then induced demand corresponds to freight transport services. Now let's look at the modes of transport. So there are 5 primary modes of transport. Road, so trucks; rail, like trains; water, like ships; air, like aircraft; and then pipelines. So the 5 primary modes of transport are road, rail, water, air, and pipeline transport. Then let's take a look at the secondary modes of transport, where we have conveyors, canals or inland waterways, and then drones. And then we can categorize the different modes of transport into unimodal, intermodal, and multimodal. Unimodal is when maybe you use one mode of transport all the time. Intermodal is when maybe you use one mode of transport, then you switch and you use another, then you switch and you use another. And then multimodal transport is basically like intermodal transport, except it's under one operator. So it's basically when one company or one organization handles all the different types of transport all in one. Let's take a closer look at road transport though. Road transport possesses significant advantages over the other modes of transport. So the capital cost of vehicles is relatively small. It has a relatively high speed of vehicles, and it's only constrained by legal speed limits. And then the flexibility of route choice and the unique opportunity to provide door-to-door service. So there's accessibility for both passengers and freight. So it's flexible, accessible, high speed, and the capital cost is relatively small. So in terms of the strengths of road transport, it's accessible, it's fast and versatile, and it has high flexibility. Then it also has high consistency, high availability, customer service, moderate speed, reduced double handling. Then in terms of limitations, it has a limited capacity and a relatively high cost, right? And then the primary role of road transport is to move smaller shipments in local, regional, national, and international markets. Then the primary economic characteristics of road transport is the moderate cost, the point-to-point or door-to-door service that it offers, but there's many competitors. And then in terms of the primary product characteristics or the types of products that you would use road transport for, they should be high value items or products, finished goods, and they should be a low volume, not a lot of them. For example, food, clothing, electronics, furniture. And then in terms of rail transport, the strengths of rail transport is that it has a high capacity and a low cost, moderate availability, moderate consistency, moderate flexibility. In terms of the limitations of rail transport is that it's not very accessible. There's inconsistent service, there's high damage rates, slow speed, and the need for double handling, right? And then the primary role is to move shipments of domestic and cross-border freight long distances. And then the primary economic characteristics of rail transport is it has a low cost, a terminal-to-terminal service, and moderate competition. And then the sort of products that would be best transported with rail transport is low-value products, raw materials, and high volume. You can have a high volume of products that you transport with rail transport. For example, coal or coke, lumber, paper, grain, chemicals, right? Now we move on to water transport or ships, right? The strengths of water transport is you can have a high capacity, a low cost, and it has international capabilities. And then the limitations of water transport is it has a slow speed, not very accessible, low availability, low to moderate consistency, low flexibility. It has a need for double handling and delay problems. And the primary role is to move large domestic shipments via rivers and canals, move large shipments of international freight via oceans. Then the primary economic characteristics are that it has a very low cost, it does have a terminal to terminal service, and there's few competitors, right? And then the sort of products that you'd want to transport with water transport should be low value, raw materials, bulk commodities, and containerized finished goods, right? For example, crude oil, ores, minerals, farm products, clothing, electronics, toys. And then we move on to air transport. So the strengths of air transport is the fast speed, freight protection, flexibility, moderate availability, and high consistency, then reduced stock holding due to speed of transfer. So because of air transport, you don't actually have to hold a lot of inventory, so reduced stock holding. Then the limitations of air transport is not very accessible. It has a very high cost, a low capacity, low to moderate flexibility, and it has security concerns, right, of freight and passenger aircraft. Then the primary role of air transport is to move urgent shipments of domestic freight and smaller shipments of international freight. And the primary economic characteristics of air transport is that it has a high cost, right? It does have a terminal to terminal service, moderate competition. And then the sort of products you'd want to transport with air transport is high value products, right? Finished goods with a low volume and very time sensitive goods. For example, computers, periodicals, pharmaceuticals, business to consumer deliveries, right? And now we move on to pipeline transport. And then the strengths of pipeline transport is that there's in-transit storage, right? There's efficiency, it has a low cost and a high consistency. And the limitations of pipeline transport are that it has a very slow speed, a limited network, low availability, and low flexibility. And its primary role is to move large volumes of domestic freight long distances, right? And the primary economic characteristics is that it has a very low cost, few competitors, and obviously it also has a terminal to terminal service. And then the sort of products you'd want to transport with pipeline transport are low value products like liquid commodities and stuff that isn't time sensitive. For example, crude oil, petroleum, gasoline, natural gas. Now let's take a look at the transporting costs, or the costs associated with transporting. So first of all, we look at the direct costs. So these are costs directly related to a cost center, like a vehicle. So this is like fuel, the vehicle road license, or the vehicle insurance, etc. Then we have indirect costs. So these are general costs that result from running a transport business, also referred to as overhead costs, admin costs, or establishment costs. So for example, this could be the office staff wages, telephone charges, advertising, rent, etc. Then we have the fixed costs. These are costs related to the cost center, vehicle, which will not vary over time. For example, depreciation, vehicle excise duty, vehicle insurance, right? Then we have variable costs. These vary with respect to the distance the vehicle travels. For example, fuel and lubricants. Now let's take a look at the challenges of urban goods transport. Well, we have environmental challenges, economical challenges, and social and institutional challenges. Well, now we're moving on to reverse logistics with Chapter 9. So what is reverse logistics? Well, this is the process of managing the flow of goods or products from their destination back to their point of origin. For example, from a customer back to the manufacturer or retailer. So it involves activities like product returns, repairs, refurbishments, recycling, and disposal. So reverse logistics is an important part of the supply chain management, as it allows companies to effectively manage and reduce waste, improve customer satisfaction, and minimize costs associated with returned or defective products. And it also helps companies be more environmentally friendly. But what are the drivers of reverse logistics in the supply chain? Well, there are economic, legislative, and environmental drivers. And then there's also corporate citizenship and consumer pressures. But now let's look at the economic drivers. Well, these are the potential cost savings that can be achieved by effectively managing returned or defective products. So refurbishing and reselling returned items, means you can save on costs of producing new products, and this leads to improved customer satisfaction, which leads to increased customer loyalty and repeat business, which boosts sales, right? And then now let's take a look at the legislative drivers. An example of this is environmental regulations that require companies to manage waste and reduce their environmental impact, right? Then now let's move on to the environmental drivers, which are very linked to the legislative drivers. So reverse logistics can help companies achieve their sustainability goals by reducing waste and extending life of products. And this is closely linked to legislative drivers. Now let's talk about the corporate citizenship and consumer pressures. So in terms of corporate citizenship, companies have a responsibility to act in the best interest of society and the environment. So they have to reduce their environmental impact and improve the communities in which they operate. So consumers, in terms of consumer pressure, consumers are increasingly environmentally conscious and will likely support enviro-friendly companies. And reverse logistics helps companies gain competitive advantage and increased customer loyalty to this end. So we spoke about the drivers, but now let's talk about the barriers to reverse logistics implementation. So there are economic barriers, there are internal barriers, external barriers, and operational barriers. So now let's talk about the economic barriers. Well, this relates to the potential cost of reverse logistics. So the process of managing returns, refurbishing, repairing, reselling, or recycling products can be expensive, right? But now let's move on to the internal barriers. Well, this includes a lack of resources, expertise, or commitment from employees or management to actually implement reverse logistics. Then let's talk about the external barriers. Well, these are challenges related to the logistics partners, suppliers, or customers. For example, an unwillingness to participate in a returns program by a supplier or a logistic partner or whatever. Then we move on to operational barriers, and this includes challenges related to logistics and transportation. For example, the unpredictability of returns. But now let's talk about product returns in the reverse logistics process. So there are three types of product returns, right? We've got manufacturer returns, distribution returns, and consumer returns. So manufacturer returns are when retailers or distributors return products to the manufacturer, right? Then we have distribution returns, and this is when retailers or customers return products to the distributor, who then manages the return process with the manufacturer. Then we move on to consumer returns. This is when customers return products to the retailer, who then manages the return process with the distributor or the manufacturer. So in terms of the manufacturer return types, we've got maybe there's a surplus of raw materials, quality control, or production leftovers and byproducts, right? And then the manufacturer return reasons would be poor production planning and forecasting, unpredictable demand or overproduction, right? And then in terms of the distribution returns, which are done by retailers or sellers, in terms of the distribution return types, we've got business-to-business commercial returns, product recalls, stock adjustments, functional returns. So in terms of the distribution return reasons, it would be service agreements, damaged and defective stock, DOA stock, wrong deliveries, inaccurate forecasts, health and safety problems, seasonal stock movement, or packaging returns, right? Then we move on to the consumer returns, right, which are done by the consumer. This includes business to consumer or commercial returns, end of use EOU returns or end of life returns EOL, and warranty returns. And then the consumer return reasons would be unwanted products and buyer's remorse, ordering errors, dissatisfaction, damages during delivery, wrong deliveries, defects on deliveries, used product return initiatives, product take-back obligations, or warranty claims or repair services. So we've got returns collection, inspection and sorting processes, disposition processes, and within the whole disposition processes, we've got the reuse option, the product recovery option, material recovery option, or the waste management option, right? And then some of the environmental standards applicable to reverse logistics are the Environmental Management ISO 1400. But now let's talk a bit more about the disposition options. So disposition is the exit route of the product. So it's important for economic and environmental performance. So some of the disposition options we have is reusing, product recovery, materials recovery, and waste management, like I said before. So in terms of reusing, this is repackaging, selling as new, or returning to stock, right? So business to business or business to consumer commercial returns. So it's repackaging and selling a product like it's new and returning it to stock. Then we have product recovery. So this involves repairing it, refurbishment of the product, or remanufacturing. And this is for EOU or EOL, so end of use or end of life, warranty returns, used products, damaged or defective products, right? That's product recovery. And then we have materials recovery. And this involves recycling. And what is recycling? Well, this is the activity or process of extracting and reusing useful substances found in waste. And this involves EOL returns, so end of life returns, used products, obsolete products, waste materials, etc. Then we have waste management. And here, this is when it goes to a landfill or it goes for incineration, compost, and animal feed. So this involves waste materials, hazardous waste, non-hazardous waste. So what are the environmental and economic benefits of disposition? Well, in terms of environmental benefits, you reduce waste, you improve environmental performance or environmental friendliness, and you comply with regulations. Then in terms of economic benefits, it's profitability, is cost savings, and the increased competitiveness of the company. So when we talk about business to business or B2B, it's a transaction between firms or businesses. For example, between a manufacturer and a distributor and or a retailer. Then when we're talking about B2C or business to consumer, this is the process of selling products and services directly between a business and consumers who are the end users, right? And then when we talk about product recalls, this is an action of retrieving a defective or unsafe product from the market. So it's the action of retrieving a defective or unsafe product from the market. Then we have functional returns. So functional returns are products that are returned because they're no longer needed or wanted by the customer, but they're still in functional condition and can be resold. Now we move on to contract logistics with chapter 11. So what is contract logistics? Well, this is the outsourcing of various supply chain management activities and services to a third or fourth party logistics provider. So in terms of the types of contract logistics, we've got transaction logistics, contract logistics, and outsourcing. So transaction logistics is a once-off transaction aimed at a specific operational activity. And then contract logistics is the taking over of part or all of an organization's logistics activities for a long period of time. And then outsourcing is when an organization uses an external supplier to take responsibility for non-core business. So now let's take a look at contract logistics versus using your own logistics capabilities. So the reasons for contract logistics. So we have the resource-based theory, RBT. This is where we assess internal resources and capabilities of the organization when evaluating benefits or risks of outsourcing logistics. Then we have the buying organization's core competencies. So here you basically focus your internal resources on core competencies that give the competitive edge, and then you outsource non-core logistics activities. But now let's take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of logistics insourcing and outsourcing. So let's take a look at the advantages of logistics insourcing. So basically keeping logistics activities in-house. So the first advantage is that you have control and integration. So it allows the organization to have full control and visibility over their supply chain activities. So better coordination and responsiveness. Then you also have specific knowledge and expertise. So organizations can develop in-depth knowledge and expertise in managing their unique supply chain requirements. Then you have flexibility and adaptability. So it provides organizations with the flexibility to quickly adapt to changing market conditions and internal requirements. And then you have strategic alignment. So it allows the organization to align logistics activities with their overall strategic objectives. Now let's take a look at the disadvantages of logistics insourcing, so keeping logistics in-house. Well, the first disadvantage is increased costs, so higher costs or resources intensity.
So it requires significant investment in infrastructure, technology, etc. Then you have limited scalability. So expanding logistics capabilities internally may take time, costs, and resources commitment. Then you have lack of specialized expertise. So you may miss out on advanced technology innovation, best practices external providers can offer. And then you have increased complexity. So managing logistics internally can add complexity to the overall business operations. Now we move on to the advantages of logistics outsourcing. So the first advantage is cost savings. So it eliminates the need for investment in infrastructure, equipment, and personnel. And then you have access to specialized knowledge and resources. So it allows companies to tap into the expertise and resources of third-party logistics providers. And then you can focus on core competencies. So by outsourcing logistics, companies can redirect their focus on their core competencies. And then the last advantage we have of logistics outsourcing is scalability and flexibility. So companies can quickly adjust their logistics operations and you can scale. But now let's take a look at the disadvantages of logistics outsourcing. Well, you have a loss of control. So you lose control over some supply chain operations. Then you have communication and coordination challenges. So outsourcing requires effective communication between the company and the 3PL. And then you have quality and service level concerns. Companies may have less control over quality and service levels provided by the 3PL. And then you have dependency on external providers. But now let's take a look at Porter's value chain and contract logistics. So in terms of cost reduction strategies, this aims to minimize expenses throughout the value chain to achieve a competitive advantage. And then in terms of differentiation strategies, it's the aim to create unique value propositions and stand out from competitors. But now let's take a look at the outsourcing life cycle. So first we start off with strategic assessment, right? Then you move on to needs analysis. Then after needs analysis, you move on to vendor assessment or supplier assessment. Then you move on to contract and negotiation management. Then from there you move on to the project initiation and transition. And then from there it's relationship management. And lastly, you go to continuance modification or exit strategies. And then back to the strategic assessment. So now let's move on to the different types of contract logistics. So first off, we look at third-party logistics providers. So these are companies that offer outsourced logistics services to businesses. So what are the roles of third-party logistics service providers? Well, we have the core competency role. So this is when the 3PL service provider focuses on managing specific logistics functions or processes that aren't the client's core competencies. So they focus on things that are not the client's core competencies. Then we have the functional outsourcing role. So this is when the 3PL provider manages and executes specific logistics functions on behalf of the client. For example, just warehousing or inventory management, etc. Then you have the complementary role. So this is when the 3PL provider collaborates with the client to enhance and complement their existing logistics capabilities. Then we move on to the strategic or collaborative role. So this is when the 3PL provider becomes a strategic partner to the client, contributing to the development and execution of supply chain strategies. Then the last role of a 3PL service provider is third-party logistics service providers' role as the orchestrator. So this is when the 3PL provider orchestrates or coordinates the entire supply chain, coordinates multiple logistics functions, stakeholders, etc. So let's take a look at the 3PL service provider types. Well, we have the standard provider. They offer basic logistics services such as transportation, warehousing, and distribution. So they have limited involvement in strategic decisions. Then we have the service developer. So these 3PL providers provide more customized and value-added solutions, and they go beyond the basic logistics services. And then you go to the customer adapter. So they adapt their logistics processes and systems to integrate seamlessly with client supply chain. So they usually have advanced IT infrastructure. Then we move on to the customer developer. So they engage in deep partnership with clients to drive strategic supply chain improvements and business growth. Now let's talk about fourth-party logistics providers. Well, this is an entity that manages and oversees the entire supply chain on behalf of the client, including coordination and integration of multiple 3PL service providers. So let's take a look at the characteristics of 3PLs and 4PLs. So in terms of 3PLs, they deal with warehousing and distribution integration. They provide IT support and infrastructure. Data tracking is localized. They own and buy assets, and they have good warehouse management systems. Then in terms of 4PLs, they envision the whole supply chain. They plan and optimize the whole supply chain, make deals happen, re-engineer the whole supply chain. They integrate services, systems, and information, and they strive for continuous innovation. Now let's talk about the selection, development, implementation, and performance evaluation of logistics providers. So the first step is selecting logistics service providers. So recognizing the need for a logistics service provider, determining potential supply sources for logistics service providers. So sources could be current suppliers, trade journals, directories, supplier visits, etc. And then you have to look at the imbalanced relationship power affecting service provider selection. So the imbalanced relationship power is basically buyer power and supplier power. In terms of buyer power, this is the influence or control the buyer has over the supplier or service provider. So it's determined by buyer's market share, purchasing volume, brand reputation, availability of other suppliers, etc. Then you look at supplier power. So this is the influence or control the supplier has over the buyer. So it's determined by supplier's market share, unique expertise or resources, scarcity of alternatives, and buyer's dependency. And then we look at the relationship continuum and comparison. So we have transactional relationships and strategic relationships. In terms of a transactional relationship, it's a short-term relationship focused on individual alternatives. So speed and efficiency here, there's flexibility, low investment, but there's a lack of trust and communication and collaboration, and there's also vulnerability. And then we have strategic relationships. So these are long-term partnerships. There's mutual trust, shared goals, and collaboration. So here there's stability and trust, shared resources and expertise, synergy and innovation. But there's also higher investment, dependency and risk, and potential conflict. And then in terms of the selection criteria, we have the cost criteria, the service or operation quality, competencies, general attributes, and relational factors. So this is very similar to the supplier selection method we had in supply management back in chapter 4. So you'll have the different measurement criteria, maybe the cost criteria, service operation, competencies, general attributes or relational factors. Then you have a weighting, and then you have a score for each individual service provider. And then what you do is that you multiply the weight with the score that each service provider gets in that particular measurement criteria or category, right? And then you get a total. You add up all those totals, and then whoever has the highest total is the service provider that we'll go with. After step 1, which is selecting the logistics service providers, the second step is development of logistics service providers. So we look at reasons for developing logistics service providers and development activities. And then the third step is contract implementation. And the fourth step is performance evaluation and continuous improvement. So now let's move on to contract management and logistics outsourcing. So what is the use of contracts in contract logistics? Well, it's reducing the time, work, and cost needed, legalize transactions between the buyer and the supplier, and assist in long-term relationship formation, reducing lead times, provide guidance for providers' responsibilities, and ensure desired quality is delivered. And then it's also to enhance the supply chain, and the nature of work spurs the need for contracts, and it promotes continuous operations. So that's the use of contracts in contract logistics. But now let's take a look at the different types of contracts. So we have fixed price contracts. Well, these set a predetermined price for goods and services which remains unchanged throughout the duration of the contract. So the price is fixed. And then we have cost-based contracts. So these reimburse the seller for the actual costs incurred, often with agreed upon fee or profit margin. So this contract recognizes that the prices can change. And then we have term contracts. These specify an agreed upon duration for the provision of goods or services between the buyer and the seller. And under term contracts, we have 3 different types. So we have a spot contract, we have a short-term contract, and a long-term contract. So spot contracts are the short-term agreements for the immediate delivery of goods or services without a fixed term. Then we have short-term contracts. These typically span a few weeks to a few months. And then we have long-term contracts. These extend over an extended period, often years, for example, a year or longer. Now let's talk about service level agreements or SLAs in contract logistics. So important aspects of an SLA is the performance plan, the quality monitoring plan, and the personnel plan, and then the performance management and guarantees. So there's 4 things: the performance plan, quality monitoring plan, personnel plan, performance management, and guarantees. And then when we talk about managing the contract content, we're looking at deliverables and then the term of contracts. So the spot contracts, short-term contracts, or long-term contracts. So what are some of the common logistics contract management pitfalls? Well, this could be when a supplier is chosen on the cost criteria only, or maybe the negotiated contract terms and KPIs aren't in line with the daily operations. Or maybe there's a mismatch between the buying organization and the supplier's strategy. And then maybe the buyer is not the user. Or suppliers are overselling their service and or product delivery. And then unclear barriers for when to terminate the contract. And then overlooking the need and importance of communication. So now let's take a look at global logistics with chapter 13. So what is global logistics? Well, this is the design and management of a system that directs and controls the flows of materials and goods into, through, and out of a firm across national boundaries to achieve its corporate objectives and minimal total cost. So it's the design and management of a system that directs and controls the flows of materials and goods into, through, and out of a firm across national boundaries to achieve its corporate objectives and minimum total cost. So now let's take a look at the controllable and uncontrollable factors of global logistics. So first we take a look at uncontrollable factors. So these are elements characterized by uncertainty, volatility, and rapid change. So the first thing we look at is political and legal systems of foreign markets, and then regional and global economic conditions, and then technological forces or factors, then competitive forces, and then social and cultural customs. So those are the 5 uncontrollable factors. And then we have controllable factors. These are elements over which logisticians have control in the internal business environment. So this could be the customer service strategy, inventory strategies, packaging strategies, and then warehousing and storage strategies. Now we move on to the 4 global distribution strategies. So these 4 strategies always try to balance or trade off the risk of asset loss with operational control of the enterprise. So the global distribution strategies we're going to look at is exporting, licensing, joint ventures, and ownership. So what is exporting? Well, this is producing goods and services in one country and finding a channel member, so a freight forwarder, distributor, brokers, trading firms, etc., to sell it into an attractive market for consumption on your behalf, basically. So it's a manufacturing plant, it produces goods and services to another person to sell it in a foreign market. So exporting is producing goods and services in one country and finding a channel member to sell it into an attractive market for consumption. So what are the advantages of exporting? Well, there's total flexibility. There's no monetary or contractual ties in the foreign market. And you have the ability to terminate or expand distribution quickly. And there's no fixed assets like warehouses. And there's no manufacturing investment in foreign market. But what are the disadvantages of exporting? Well, there's tariffs for exporting goods, import quotas on receiving market may prevent sales, little control of product handling, difficulties due to competing with local suppliers, middlemen decide on markets, pricing and promotions, currency complications, and reliant on intermediary expertise to sell products. And then we move on to the other global distribution strategy, which is licensing. So licensing is an agreement between 2 countries where one firm permits another firm to make a product using their recipe or employ processes that belong to the first firm. So what are the advantages of licensing? Well, there's minimal risk due to minor capital outlays, and the licensor has more control over distribution. And then you can overcome high tariff barriers since local manufacturer is there and they're the ones who are manufacturing the goods. And then the disadvantages of licensing is that the licensee can become a potential competitor. And then the licensee might find it hard to cancel agreement if a contract has been signed. And then the licensee might have to raise capital to develop new manufacturing sites. And then we move on to a joint venture. So what is a joint venture? Well, it's a partnership between two or more companies from different countries to collaborate in the distribution of products or services in international markets, with one firm buying an ownership interest in another. So the advantages of joint ventures include the fact that the investor can control the business better since there's more managerial input allowed. So there's more managerial input regarding the financial partnership, quick access to the foreign market. Investing partner is allowed to use knowledge and specialized skills of the local partner. Then the reputation of the local partners gives the joint venture credibility. Then there's immediate access to the local distribution system of that foreign country. Then there's effective in countries where the foreign partner isn't allowed to own land or buildings. And then it's also effective where organizations lack capital or personnel to expand internationally and need a partner in a foreign country. And then the disadvantages of a joint venture is that the risk is higher and flexibility is lower due to the partnership between firms. And then often the local firm enjoys the benefit of the majority ownership. And then the local partner could become a competitor, and there could be a possible conflict with the partner. Then we move on to the last global distribution strategy with ownership. So what is ownership? This is establishing wholly owned branches or subsidiaries in foreign markets. So the advantages of ownership is that you have total control. There's no need for a partner. Customs duties and other important taxes may be eliminated as a subsidiary becomes a domestic entity in that country. But the disadvantages of ownership is that flexibility is lost due to long-term commitment to the foreign market. And then there's the risk of government nationalization of the business and revoking ownership. Now let's talk about channel intermediaries. Well, what is a distribution channel? Well, a distribution channel is the means by which a manufacturer distributes products from the manufacturing plant to the ultimate user. So it includes warehouses, brokers, wholesalers, and retailers. So the length of the distribution channel can be influenced by the following: the complexity of technical requirements, the lifespan of the product, the price of the product, service requirements, and turnover. And then the different categories we have under channel intermediaries is industrial buyers, wholesalers, retailers, freight forwarders, non-vessel operating common carriers, export management firms, trading firms, customs house brokers, ship brokers, agents, export packers. Now let's take a look at the terms of sale. So we have Incoterms. So the category 1 Incoterms is any mode of transport. Then the category 2 Incoterms are sea and inland waterway transport. Now let's move on to supply chain risk management and resilience with chapter 14. Let's take a look at the philosophy of risk. Uncertainty and risk perception. So uncertainty is integral to risk, while risk itself implies some form of uncertainty. And then let's talk more about risk. Well, risk is uncertain future events that could influence the achievement of the firm's objectives. When risk materializes, it may lead to consequences which may be positive or negative. So uncertainty is neither static nor absolute. Let's take a look at the trade-off between uncertainty and time. So we have a graph with uncertainty on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. Then we have a parabola. And essentially, as time increases, as time passes, your insight increases and your uncertainty decreases. So you have your initial insight and then improved insight and then target insight. So as time passes, your insight increases and uncertainty reduces. So in terms of risk perception, we've got judgment. Risk seeking or risk averse, more knowledge leads to improved perception, and then risk exposure may change level of risk perception. Let's take a look at the supply chain management and risk management concept. So what are the effects of globalization on supply chain management? Well, it creates opportunities but also new challenges and complexities. For example, international transport costs, insurance, packaging, etc. Something else you should know is that supply chains are vulnerable to cross-border disruptions. Global links makes the effect of one disrupted link bigger. Changing customer needs can cause the need for supply chains to be more compressed, flexible, and agile than before. And more strategic planning is required for supply chains to deliver value. So let's take a look at the typical supply chain risks. So there are 3 supply chain risk categories. So first of all, we have external environment, and this is beyond your control. It's beyond the logistician's control. And then we have supply chain processes, and this is within your control. And then we have supply chain information, and this is also within your control. So let's take a look at the types of risks under the external environment risk category of supply chains. So the first one is political, and then you have regulatory, then legal, then the competitor, customer wants, technological innovation, culture, terrorism, epidemic outbreaks, and then natural disasters. So all of these are examples of risks under the external environmental risks which are beyond your control. Political, regulatory, legal, competitors, customer wants, technological innovation, culture, terrorism, epidemic outbreaks, and natural disasters. And now let's take a look at the types of risks under the supply chain process risks. So first of all, we have partnering. So partnering could pose a risk to the supply chain organization. And then we have insourcing, outsourcing, net sourcing. So the supply chain organization may not leverage relevant e-business opportunities to improve supply chain performance. Service failure, safety, health and environment, business interruption, customer satisfaction, human resources, IT infrastructure, systems integration, supplier, compliance, channel effectiveness, process effectiveness, and supply chain collaboration and cycle time. So these are all the types of risks under the supply chain process risks. And remember, these are within your control. So it's partnering, insourcing, outsourcing, net sourcing, service failure, safety, health and environment, business interruption, customer satisfaction, human resources, IT infrastructure, systems integration, supplier, compliance, channel effectiveness, process effectiveness, supply chain collaboration, and cycle time. Now we move on to the types of risks under the supply chain information risks. These are also within your control. So we look at information availability, then information integrity, and then information security, then measurement, and then contract management. So information management and information contract management. So those are the supply chain information risks. So now let's take a look at supply chain risk profiles. So we've got 5 of them: supply risk, demand risk, process risk, control risk, and then environmental risks. So in terms of supply risk, global sourcing and reduction of the supplier base can cause significant disruptions in the supply of products and or raw materials. And then what about demand risk? Well, this is analyzing dependent and independent demand and ensuring accurate fast flow of information. And then we have process risk. So this is identifying bottlenecks, capacity requirements, and the process mapping and process improvements. And then we have control risk. So internal policies on safety stock, batch sizes, minimum order quantities, etc. And then we have environmental risks. So the probable impact of environmental disturbances must be assessed and known to the firm. So you have supply risk, process risk, demand risk, and within there, control risk is kind of encapsulating the process risk and connects to the supply and demand risk. Then you have the environment as a whole separate entity. So supply chain disruption management, let's talk about that. Well, there's 4 phases. You've got disruption detection, so detecting the disruption. Then you have disruption reaction, reacting to it. Disruption recovery, recovering from it. And then disruption learning, learning from it and preparing for the next disruption. So let's take a look at capabilities and enablers of supply chain resilience. Well, we have flexibility, information sharing and visibility, redundancy, reduction of complexity, collaboration, velocity, and agility. And this is changing upstream.